So I think I remember coming across some accounts according to which during the summer season, when the winds were favorable, one could have in some cases traveled from Rome to Alexandria in a few days. But I think usually even that trip, the more direct sea route from Alexandria to Rome, would have been something like 20 days. And then especially in other seasons when the winds were not as favorable, it was dangerous to travel in general, but you certainly couldn't travel from Alexandria to Rome taking the direct route, but you had to go via the northern or north shores, and that could take even a couple of months, that kind of trip. So yes, we're talking about a very time-consuming practice.
Hello and welcome to It Means What It Means, the podcast in which a guy with some college and a day job has long-form conversations about biblical texts. Today, much like the Alexiana Fry episode, we're taking some modern concepts. So in this case, anxiety and our understanding of anxiety, and using that concept within early Jewish literature to understand the feelings and points of view of people from the ancient world. I think it's pretty cool that scholars are able to do this. I know that might seem to some like it runs the risk of anachronism. I get it, but I think these lines of inquiry are important, and they help us see people are people, and we're not that special. I won't delay anymore, except to say, if you want to reach out to me for suggestions, feedback, input, whatever, it means what it means at gmail.com. I would love to hear from you. I would love to hear from you if you want to be on, or if you have read a book or a paper by someone you want to be on here, or if you just have an idea, you want to point me in a certain direction. It means what it means, all one word, at gmail.com. That's all from me. I hope you enjoy this conversation I had with Elisa Uusimäki. Elisa Uusimäki, welcome to the podcast.
So much, Jared, for the invitation.
Before we get going, will you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so my name is Elisa Uusimäki. I come originally from Finland, and I studied and was trained at the University of Helsinki, though I also spent some years abroad as a grad student and as a postdoc. And then eventually I also moved to Denmark, where I got a permanent position at Aarhus University. And I have been here in Denmark since the beginning of 2020. So yeah, just 4 years now, working as a professor of biblical studies at Aarhus University. Aarhus is the second biggest city in Denmark, and we have a really nice department of theology with several biblical scholars. In terms of my research area, work currently on travel, and that's also the topic that we will be discussing today, but it's not the first theme or topic that I've been working on. So I started my career with the Dead Sea Scrolls. My dissertation focused on one previously unknown text from Qumran. It was quite a traditional philological study that also made me ask further questions about wisdom, and especially lived wisdom in early Judaism. And then I moved on to work on the figure of the wise person in the ancient Jewish tradition, and that's the topic of my second book, especially interested not so much in wisdom as a literary genre or as a category of literature, but on the question of what is a wise person like, or how does one become wise, what does a wise person do. But then these studies on wisdom and the wise person also made me think about travel and movement, though those phenomena have also characterized my own life in recent years and decades. So perhaps there was a personal interest as well. But so that's the topic that I have been exploring in the past couple of years, travel in the ancient Jewish tradition. I'm writing a book on women's travel in the ancient Jewish tradition, but then I also have various case studies related to other aspects of travel and movement in the ancient world. But I'm sure we will get back to the question of travel in the ancient world in a little while. But that's my academic profile in a nutshell. Otherwise, I don't know what to tell about myself. I don't know. I feel like my life is very boring. Probably don't have very cool things to tell, but I guess I'm quite a curious person. I do to learn new things about the world, whether by reading news or fiction or perhaps traveling, moving around myself. And then also, I don't know, of course, academic work, it's a lot of sitting and reading and staring at the screens. I also do to move in the physical sense in my free time. So yeah, skiing is my all-time favorite. And I've just been in my native Finland to celebrate Christmas, and I was happy to ski every day. But now I'm back to Denmark, and here I don't have that opportunity. So here I guess I do other things, running and swimming in cold water and some yoga and Pilates and so forth.
For someone who said it's probably a boring life, you just described a very busy life. I don't think anyone, for sure me, I don't think anybody listening thinks that's a boring life, what you just described. That sounds like a very intellectually and physically and emotionally fulfilling life. But yeah, so the article that we're going to be discussing is from the Journal of Biblical Literature, and it is Travel and Anxiety in Early Jewish Literature. So I try to sit down and prepare myself mentally a few minutes before the interview. And I was thinking about the overlap between this and the discussion that I had with Alexiana Fry, which I'm not sure if you had a chance to listen to it, but the kind of transdisciplinary nature of biblical studies, where she's talking about trauma and we're applying a ubiquitous concept like trauma in from the contemporary world onto an ancient setting, and you're doing very much a similar thing with this. So I'm gonna ramble for a second here. In my mind, as I was trying to prepare for the interview, I realized, so the first question that I sent you was, since anxiety is a ubiquitous term these days, please explain how you were using it in this article. But broadening that out, I don't want to limit where we start, because that's really where things are going to take us for the rest of the interview. But there's anxiety, there's travel, there's early Jewish literature, there's all of these things. I'll say dealer's choice, because you're the expert here. Where do you want to start as far as to the uninitiated? How should they understand what you're doing here?
Thanks. I think the whole question of anxiety, it was a bit intuitive, or the way I started to work on the question of anxiety. So my very first article on travel was already during my previous project on the figure of the wise person, when I came across the book of Ben Sira, which has a couple of references to how the ideal wise person moves around and travels and also gains some understanding by means of travel. And then I came interested in this kind of educational benefit of travel and how one may learn new things. And yeah, I was looking at how different ancient authors kind of celebrate travel as a way to gain knowledge. So a very positive notion of an appreciation of travel. But then I also, when I was working I started to work on my current travel project, and go through different types of travel texts. I also realized that it's not just about happy, positive things. Travel is also socially very complex phenomenon, and it gives rise to various emotional reactions. It disrupts social ties. It can cause fears and worries. And I thought that I should also address this other side of the coin to give a nuanced picture of what travel was and how it was perceived in the ancient Jewish tradition, and perhaps more broadly in the Mediterranean antiquity. And then I started to collect some texts that I had come across that, in my opinion, seemed to talk about travel and anxiety. There is no particular term anxiety on which these texts would revolve, or they don't use a particular adjective. So I also understood quite soon that this can't be a philological study focused on analyzing the occurrence of a particular term. And then I was just literally Googling how different scholars in different fields have understood anxiety and what kind of definitions they have given to it. And then I quickly, of course, found some psychological studies where anxiety is defined as an emotion, and it's often associated with another emotion, fear, and defined as the fear or anticipation of negative consequences in particular. So it's related to another emotion, and there is overlap, but then there is also some difference between fear and anxiety in this sense, in that fear tends to have more identifiable objects and specific clocky, whereas anxiety tends to be a bit more vague and fuzzy and therefore puzzling. And it was especially scholars drawing on affect theory or affect studies that pointed out this aspect of anxiety, and it just really, I thought that it's the type of approach that would help me to communicate what I think is happening in these early Jewish materials. Because in this text, the travel related anxiety, it's not, I guess, what could be called cognitively shaped emotion, or emotion that is clearly identified and articulated and evaluated, but it's a bit more formless and fuzzy phenomenon related to various travel related fears or anticipations of negative consequences in the context of travel. And in a study where I need to read between the lines and try to discover meanings that are, in my opinion, clearly intended by the authors, but perhaps not directly expressed in the written text, this kind of approach seemed beneficial and fruitful. And then at some point, a colleague of mine read one early version of the article, and she had actually done some coursework on affect theory in grad school and had very helpful tips to me and encouraging me to deepen the affect aspect of the article. And that's what I did, but it was something completely new to me when I first started to write this article. I was collecting texts that I thought would count as literary and cultural representations of travel-related anxiety, but it was really unclear to me at that point how the article would unfold in terms of method and theory. And then I discovered the affect theory and its interpotential on the way. But I certainly would not consider myself to be any kind of specialist in affect theory or in the application of affect theory to the biblical or other ancient literature. This is just a case study where I wish to address one phenomenon, travel-related anxiety in the ancient world, and I discovered on the way that I really have to make use of anxiety and how anxiety has been articulated in psychological studies, but also in affect studies, in order to communicate how anxiety emerges in several different ways in the sources. So I guess my overall conclusion here is that it does cover some kind of explicit emotions, rational fears of well-being and safety, but then in many cases the question is about more unspoken affective elements like uncertainties of intergroup anxiety.
So as I'm listening to you, I'm realizing that I think, okay, so I don't know how familiar you are like with the map of the United States, but my family's all from Virginia and I currently live in Houston. And when I was 6 years old, my mother and I moved from Virginia to Houston, and I spent most of the rest of my childhood going back and forth between those two places, which for the late 80s, early 90s, even now, like that kind of travel, yeah, it's a big deal, but it's not really a big deal until I got jet lag for the first time. I didn't really take travel seriously, but I wonder if maybe travel for us, like anxiety, but even more so, is it's everywhere, and so it doesn't mean as much to us as it should. Is that so? In studying in an ancient context, how it affects social and interpersonal, or how I'm sure there's a lot of different categories and spheres that you could put on that. Is travel a more significant thing than maybe we give it credit for being?
Yeah, I think it depends on, in a way, yes, if you have a Finnish passport or if you have a US passport. So we do take travel for granted in a way that you could not do in the ancient world. The types of distances that we travel and the ease with which we travel just would be unthinkable in that context. But also in my book on women's travel, I'm also trying to present some intersectional remarks on travel. And I think that would also concern our societies. We may be also blind to how travel might be perceived differently also today in our own communities, depending on the social and other locations that people find themselves in. So it could be dangerous to generalize. But of course, you are right in that scale of travel and also the financial cost of travel completely depends in our time. But then again, there are also like some timeless aspects of travel. Of course, for instance, this question of kind of social ties, travel disrupting family and social ties. I think that's something we can certainly identify with if we compare our own lives with the texts from the ancient world, though our means of communication are different, and it's possible for us to make phone calls or WhatsApp calls and send all kinds of messages. Something has changed there as well, but I personally at least have still experienced also the kind of disruptive aspect or dimension of travel, while it has at the same time enabled amazing things in my own life.
So I guess in that way, it's not good or bad. There's benefits and there are costs involved.
Exactly, the ambiguity, and I think the ambiguity of travel is exactly what I try to highlight in this in this article. That it's not like either fully positive or fully negative, but it does both. It enables things, but it also disrupts things and causes fears and worries. And it's a socially complex phenomenon in both of those dimensions, and everything between needs to be considered if we want to understand travel as a human phenomenon.
So you focus on 4 texts, but
Yeah.
I'm sure there were more that you probably cut out that you didn't consider. Which was the first one that you came across and you thought, "Oh, this is a depiction of anxiety"?
I think maybe the first one, I can't remember now, was it Philo of Aramaic Levi document, but I think it was one of the instructional texts, which may be surprising because, as you say, I have 4 different cases that I discuss in the article, and 2 of them are kind of more explicit travel narratives that in a very clear way talk about travel-related fears and worries. But then I have also, and that's what I call in this article, kind of acute anxiety. But then I have also 2 examples of what I call chronic anxiety, one from the Aramaic Levi document and another from Philo of Alexandria, where the authors seem to address broader societal phenomena that create certain anxieties related to human mobility. And I think those are the texts that I had come across earlier when I was working on the wisdom tradition, because one of them belongs to a philosophical treatise and another is a part of a priestly wisdom instruction. So perhaps not as obvious cases, and also cases where I really felt that I need this affect theory to make my point, because the narratives where the discussion on worries and fears is more explicit, there I could have perhaps drawn on more traditional psychological studies on anxiety to make the point. But then regarding the wisdom and philosophical texts, I think I really had to draw on affect studies to be able to read between the lines. But it's been a long time in making the article, and I wouldn't even dare to say when I first came across those texts. But
That's fair. That's a thing I didn't realize when I started this podcast, is how long it takes. I have an interview recorded now, and the guy still has no idea when it's going to be published. So I'm holding on to it because I was advised that sometimes the editors don't care for that. Things like that being publicized.
It can take a long time, but also just the process with some articles. Of course, there are some articles that I have written quite fast, but then sometimes it takes many years to just put things together. And this is one of those articles. I have another article that I started to write 5 years ago, and I think I'm hoping to finish and submit it next month. But I think this travel and anxiety was almost as long. The process was almost as long, but certainly the text, when I first would have come across them, would have been even earlier. But They're therefore very different types of texts, and they highlight different aspects of travel-related anxiety. But I think they're all good representatives of early Jewish literature and what this corpus says about travel.
So, given then that wisdom and travel is such an area of emphasis for you, I guess let's like jump to the part about Philo of Alexandria, because I am interested to hear, and it does not have to be limited to this article. Just keep in mind, like people who just are listening to this podcast casually may never read the article, so you get to talk about whatever you want of your work. This is your show. It's my show, but it's your show today. How far down the wisdom and travel rabbit hole do you feel like taking us?
Yeah, so if we start with Philo of Alexandria, so I guess many would have heard about him, a Jewish philosopher and exegete from the 1st century CE. And I had previously thought about Philo in terms of his comments on the positive effects of travel and how one may gain wisdom and understanding and knowledge by means of travel. And then I had also thought a little bit about the Therapeutae, the group of Jewish philosophers depicted in the Vita Contemplativa, who withdraw from the city of Alexandria to the Meretic Lake to pursue a contemplative life. But then the text of Philo that I'm discussing in this article on travel and anxiety is a part of one of his treatises, and he has obviously tons of those. And in this particular text, he discusses the difference between what he perceives as a bad man and a good man, that is the cultivator of the soul. And he illustrates the distinction between these two types of figures, one of whom is focused on his earthly body and its pleasures, and the other on the cultivation of the soul, by means of two biblical figures, Cain and Noah. So Cain is the worker who focuses on the earthly things, and then Noah is the cultivator of the soul. And taking the two figures and the dichotomy between them as his starting point, he moves on to criticize travel that aims at increasing this worldly pleasure and profit. And he writes, maybe I can quote here briefly, the great crowd of people who traverse the regions of the earth and reach its very limits, cross the high seas, search the depths of the sea, and leave no part of the whole unexplored. Such people are continually and everywhere engaged in providing those things which enable pleasure to be increased. Indeed, they mine the earth and traverse the high seas and perform all the deeds of peace and war, supplying generous amounts of material for pleasure, as if for a queen. They are uninitiated in the skill of cultivating the soul, which sows and plants the virtues and harvests them a happy life. Here he presents the greedy masses travel in contrast to soul cultivation, and is critical of people whose trips aim at finding lavish materials and luxurious goods. In his opinion, such travel is not sustainable and indicates a lack of consideration for true priorities. So here we get a really interesting glimpse of Philo, who lived in around the turn of the era and in the early 1st century CE. So we're talking about a period when travel had become more and more common, also safer, and clearly facilitated amassing great wealth as well. So it seems likely that the criticism he presents here is rooted in his own experiences and encounters with people in the upper circles of Alexandria. Perhaps they also caused some over reality to some people in his own Jewish community. His point is obviously to encourage people to reject such a greedy or such a travel driven by greed and interest. Instead, he hopes that people would dedicate themselves to a way of life that does not aim at maximizing pleasure, but rather focuses on the question of soul cultivation, which in his opinion enables one's well-being. So this is probably the most tricky form of anxiety that I discuss in my article. It's not the type of anxiety that we have, for instance, in the narrative texts where a person traveling or a relative of a person traveling is worried about the safety of a person on the move. But here we are talking about Philo's anxiety in the sense that his apprehension and anticipates negative consequences that are caused by such greedy travel and the presumed harmful effects of pleasure on one's being. He's very pessimistic about such choices and wants his audience to pursue other things in life. Yeah, this is actually the text out of the 4 texts that I discussed in the article. It's the one that I was most uncertain about, and until the end, it was actually a bit unclear whether this text would be included in the article, because the type of anxiety at stake is not perhaps the type of travel-related anxiety that we would expect to find or would immediately recognize as travel-related anxiety. But then at the same time, I think I wanted to include the text in the article because it's also a text that enables us to see that travel-related anxiety, it's not just about social life and immediate emotional reactions on the move or to our close ones on the move, but travel-related anxiety can also be something more societal and more chronic in nature, related to in the societies in which we live, and perhaps also in our own time when we are reconsidering our travel practices because of climate issues, for instance. So this kind of travel-related anxiety, I think, is worth addressing, even if it's a bit more fuzzy and difficult to grasp than the other forms of travel-related anxiety that I address in the article.
On the one hand, a contemporary analog for that might be my mother putting me on a plane when I was 7, 8 years old to go to Virginia, or my dad doing the same thing on the other end, where, until I know he's safe, I don't know where he is or what's going on. I just know I put him on a plane and the plane took off. And then, so that would be the narrative examples in some
Yeah.
way.
Yeah.
And then the instructive, at least the Philo example,
Mhm.
would be more along the lines of people who fly in private jet, because you mentioned like the climate crisis,
Exactly.
people who fly, it's an indulgence, and it is ultimately something that is, granted, here's where the analogy falls apart, because we're talking about climate, but you would be saying, not you, but one would be saying, if applying this to that person, there's a certain amount of degradation or diminution happening to that person because they're not pursuing the right ends. Is that fair to say?
In Philo's opinion, this type of travel does not enable the true well-being of the person, or it's not good for the society as a whole, and therefore there is a destructive element to it, and he wishes to criticize it. And I briefly point out in the end of the section that he is not the only author in the Roman period who shows some hesitation regarding certain types of travel, and I do not discuss them in detail in this article, but perhaps it's something I should research in the future. But anyway, I do point out that we have also texts like Seneca and Epictetus who criticize leisure trips of the wealthy who travel as a cure for discontent or to escape from troubles. So the body of critique that these authors and Philo present, they're a little bit different, but I think some of these examples shows that the Roman intelligentsia seems to have been more broadly concerned with the ethical aspects of travel, and they were also aware of the negative consequences of travel in case it lacked a good purpose. And these texts might provide interesting conversation partners to us today. But as you say, also the narrative texts are interesting, but perhaps more on a personal rather than a societal level. They help us understand, for instance, as you say, our parents' worries when we as children were or are on the move, or other forms of travel that kind of challenge the maintenance of social ties.
And you don't have to answer this if you don't feel comfortable, but since you mention rough contemporaries of Philo, how similar or different was he from the world he was in? And I guess that would speak more to how distinct or how integrated were early Jewish communities and their literature
Yeah,
when considered within the world around them.
yeah, no, thanks. That's an important question. And in general, as for early Jewish authors, of course, there are different levels to which they engage with for instance, the Greco-Roman culture around them. But overall, in recent years, scholars have moved beyond this Hellenistic, non-Hellenistic dichotomy, and most scholars would say that all forms of early Judaism, or all forms of Judaism in the Hellenistic Roman periods are Hellenistic Judaism, broadly understood. But there are different types of Hellenistic Judaism. And now when it comes to Philo, it's clear that we are talking about a person who is very integrated into the Greco-Roman culture. He's got the highest education. He produces new philosophical literature in Greek. He comes from an influential, wealthy family, has connections. He also traveled to Rome himself. So absolutely, when it comes to Philo of Alexandria, we should not see him in any way detached from the wider Greco-Roman world. Of course, in that context, he's asking the question of how to make sense of his ancestral inheritance in that new context, and he's trying to spell out the contemporary relevance of the nomos of Moses to his community and society.
Another example of early Judaism is Qumran. So they're pretty different from Philo, right?
Well, I guess many people would say so, but I'm not 100% sure how. Of course, in many ways they are different already because they write in Semitic languages. The text we have from Qumran are mostly in Hebrew and Aramaic. We have some text in Greek as well, but mostly in Semitic languages. So of course that already, it's a different worldview, different type of categories and concepts that they would use. But then I think in recent years there have been quite a few studies that have also reconsidered the relation between the scrolls and the wider Hellenistic context. And scholars have pointed out how we have, or how aspects of the movement and their thought or ideology are best understood as forms of Hellenistic culture, and there have also been kind of concrete comparative studies of phenomena detected in the scrolls and in the wider Greco-Roman society. So I think many people would now like to get beyond the sort of particularist paradigm and look at different forms of cultural collaboration that are reflected in the Dead Sea Scrolls. For instance, I have been interested in the question of wisdom, and to me it seems clear that this group, they're certainly interested in promoting their own form of wisdom and their own understanding of wisdom, but at the same time, they are doing it in a way that clearly draws on the wider Hellenistic world in different ways. Yes, there is a difference, but perhaps we should be wary of simplifying and try to form a nuanced picture of the group known from the scrolls.
Would it be fair to say at least that they were more ascetic to his kind of cosmopolitan
Well, I mean,
life?
asceticism seems to be everywhere at this period. Also, Philo of Alexandria, he writes, I have written a couple of articles on the figure of wise person and also ascesis, spiritual exercise, and mental training at Philo's texts. So he's very devoted to ascesis as well. And also, if we think of the Therapeuti, the group that withdraws from Alexandria in the Vita Contemplativa, according to, they dedicate themselves to asceticism. So that's exactly an argument that I make in my other book, Lived Wisdom in Jewish Antiquity, that both the Dead Sea Scrolls group and Philo's therapeutic could be seen as some kind of wisdom groups. They dedicate themselves to the pursuit of wisdom and the good life. And there are quite a few parallels between them. But I think this is now getting quite far away from travel and anxieties.
Like I said, the conversation's going to go where the conversation goes. I'm not worried about that. But if you want to rein it in, I will say this was making me think of the idea that comes up in the article of Philo referring to a, quote, still life. So bringing up the idea of him having some admiration or alignment with asceticism himself, what was a still life for someone like him? Or how could we understand that in the ancient world more broadly, do you think?
Yeah. So as you say, he was a kind of well-educated cosmopolitan figure. He says that he traveled to Jerusalem at least once, and then we also know that he spent a longer period of time in Rome. So we know that he himself also had to travel distances that were really long in his time. Long distance travel was part of his own life story as well. But then he's really interested in the figure of wise person, sage Sophos, and the way in which he usually portrays the sage outlines a person who is dedicated to the life of the mind and someone who does not love solitude, basically. So this creates an image of still life and perhaps withdrawal. And now I have already mentioned the therapeutic in a couple of times. So certainly in the case of this group of philosophers, they are concretely depicted to withdraw from the city of Alexandria to a more peaceful place in the countryside by the lake, Meretic Lake. I think this treatise gives us an impression of kind of concrete withdrawal for the sake of getting rid of the city and its noise and busyness. But then again, I think probably ideally the person dedicated to the life of the mind and loving solitude should be able to attain that state regardless of the external conditions. So I think the still life could happen in many different contexts, but Philo clearly does not deny the fact that physical withdrawal or relocation away from the city could assist a person in the acquisition of ethical and emotional perfection that then characterize the life of a wise person.
So I'm wondering also the footprint of his life. So my commute to work is about 50 miles and then 50 miles home. And that is not a reasonable range, I assume, for someone in the ancient world to have on a regular basis. What would be an equivalent? Here's the size of what this person's normal life looks like, do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it really can't. Again, I would come back to intersectionality. I think people had very different types of lives. In antiquity, some would have had very local lives, while others, or to others, long distance travel was part of everyday life. If we think, for instance, of soldiers or traders or slaves, it's very difficult to generalize. But you're right about the perception of distance. That would have been very different. Something like 30 kilometers could be the maximum one can even walk in a day. So already 30-kilometer distance is a long distance in a society where people would mostly travel by foot or by donkey. Of course, then when we talk about overseas travel by ship was quicker and more efficient, so it would enable people to travel longer distances, but it would also cost more. But even sea travel, I'm not sure if it's necessarily as quick and efficient as we would think. So I think I remember coming across some accounts according to which during the summer season, when the winds were favorable, one could have in some cases traveled from Rome to Alexandria in a few days. But I think usually even that trip, the more direct sea route from Alexandria to Rome, would have been something like 10 or 20 days. And then especially in other seasons when the winds were not as favorable, it was dangerous to travel in general, but you certainly couldn't travel from Alexandria to Rome taking the direct route, but you had to go via the northern or northwestern shores, and that could could take even a couple of months. That kind of trip. Yes, we're talking about a very time-consuming practice that also required financial investment. And because of that, what we would see as long-distance travel was not very common, apart from certain groups of professionals. But then at the same time, what they would have perceived as long-distance travel was also different from what we perceive as long-distance travel. And I guess perhaps what we think of as regional travel would have been a major trip. Sometimes I think, for instance, the story about Hannah and her family in the books of Samuel traveling to Shiloh for the sake of pilgrimage, if it's something like 30 kilometers north of Jerusalem. So a day's trip, so it doesn't sound like a long trip to us, but in that context would have been a major trip, but also seems like a trip that is presented as credible in the narratives. So it gives us the impression that this type of travel happened.
That makes sense that there's a lot of cost issues and logistical issues involved that we don't really have to worry about anymore. But then also, like, even traveling a couple of days, if you live an agrarian life, that means that kind of things have to be wrapped up back home. This is probably a good opportunity to transition to the narratives. I'll just preface them with this. If you're used to reading a Bible that doesn't have apocryphal books, you will not have read these very likely. Tobit particularly was one I was like, I realized I've never read that. So I went through my brand new SBL study Bible and I went ahead and marked my place there so I could read it. I didn't want to spend too much time reading it before the interview. I figured I would probably get some information out of you before I sat down to read it. But Tobit and the Book of Jubilees. So I guess my first question before we get into you going into what those stories are and why you decided to use those, are they representative literature? Is that why you picked them? Broadly speaking, of the narratives that you see depictions of anxiety in early Judaism? And if they are, can you think of an outlier story that you were like, this applies, but it doesn't really present it in the same way that I see the consensus on this being?
Yeah, I don't know if they are representative in the sense that all texts would pay equal attention or be as interested in travel-related anxiety. So in that sense, I wouldn't say that they are general examples of a broader trend. Rather, I have chosen these two texts because I think they illustrate two different but equally important traditions of narrative writing in the context of early Jewish literature. The Book of Jubilees is a rewriting of the Book of Genesis, and in so doing, it does help us understand the Jewish reception of biblical narrative and how the author of texts such as the Book of Jubilees read things into Genesis that are not made explicit by the author, whereas the Book of is a great example of more novelistic literature in the context of early Judaism. The book is often compared with other novels from Jewish antiquity or from the wider Greco-Roman world. And I think the Book of Tobit helps us understand how the genre of a novel kind of develops in early Judaism. We have some novels already in the Hebrew Bible, but we can see from the Book of Tobit how this genre becomes, more developed and results in great narratives in the centuries towards the turn of the era.
So between those two, which one would you like to dive into here to talk about? It's like the narrative depiction of anxiety and travel.
It's really up to you, but perhaps we could take the Book of Tobit because it's the Book of Jubilees is of course a very long book that rewrites much of the biblical narrative known from the beginning of the Pentateuch, but then the Book of Tobit is one narrative focused on a couple of figures, so a bit more self-contained. So perhaps we could talk about the Book of Tobit. But both of them, Jubilees and Tobit, pay attention to the psychological difficulty of relocation and the way it affects relations between family members and the worries it causes too. So in that sense, either one of them would illustrate similar questions. But yeah, let's look at the Book of Tobit if you like.
So Tobit is the main character of the story, correct? But this particular portion of the story is following his son.
Yeah, so the book is named after Tobit. a figure who is said to have ended up in Nineveh in Assyria because of a forced migration in the 8th century BCE, and then started a family in his new location. But actually most of the book focuses on depicting the journey undertaken by Tobit's son Tobias. And this narrative, even if according to the book takes place in the 8th century BCE context, the text actually comes from the Hellenistic period, and it has also aspects of a romance. So it clearly comes from the provenance of the text. It's not the historical situation it describes. But the book mentions several incidents of travel. Now, I already mentioned how it's presented as forced migrant who relocated to Assyria, but then we have also some references to pilgrimages to Jerusalem, and then a reference to a business trip to Media he had made. So the book creates an impression of an experienced traveler who moves around, and travel is clearly a natural part of everyday life for him. But then now the book, quite soon after the book begins, the focus is on portraying Tobit as an old man. So he's become blind and already hoping to die, but then he remembers a deposit that he had left to Media, and then he informs his son Tobias about the resources, and Tobias then wishes to embark on a journey to collect the money from Media. So the text doesn't actually really portray the trip itself, even if the question is clearly about a major trip. So if we look at the map today, the distance between Nineveh and Rages is almost 1,000 kilometers. We are talking about a really long trip that seems to take place in the Silk Roads network. But instead of the itinerary, the text focuses on elaborating on the farewell scene before Tobias embarks on his journey. Then we have also an extended narrative focusing on the time of Tobias at the destination, where he also ends up marrying his son. And then we have a description of his departure from Rages, and then finally homecoming. So yeah, quite a few scenes that are related to travel. But in terms of the trip that Tobias makes, we only learn about paid guide that Tobit, the father, hires, and then we also have an interesting reference to a dog that travels with the retinue. But most of the text actually focuses on kind of interaction between the family members and the feelings and behavior prompted by travel among the family members.
So the motivation for the trip is some kind of financial gain. Deposit not really being conversant in with this. Is that understood to be something specific, or could that just be a broad? This could be any number of things. It's just this kind of commercial activity. Was it a loan that he gave to some? What is the deposit?
Yeah, we don't really, the text doesn't really tell much about previous business trip of Tobias. It just says, I think it's in chapter 1, is it verses 13 to 14, how Tobit had made a trip to Media, and how he had left 10 talents of silver to a relative living in Rages, but it's not really explained. The reader is just told that there is this money in Rages that actually belongs to Tobit and his family, and now Tobit is old and desiring his own death. So perhaps there is also an element of anxiety. He realizes that while the family has some resources that are far away from where they are now, and then he perhaps feels some fear and uncertainty regarding the resources of the family, and perhaps losing them in case he dies when the money is still in Rages. So that prompts then him to tell about the money to his son, who then embarks on the trip to go and get the money back.
So there was a certain amount of interest for the family's well-being then. That was a motivation, potentially. I'm going to die. I need to make sure you guys are taken care of. Go get this money. But then he doesn't return. They start counting up the amount of time that he's been gone, and he's been gone too long. So they both get nervous.
Yes.
Tobit and his wife. And so this was an interesting wrinkle. I feel like you mentioned Tobit is anxious, and I'm just paraphrasing here. Tobit is
Mm.
anxious. His wife is too, and he starts to, I don't know, is he trying to comfort her or is he just trying to shut her up? How do you read that? Because at this point, you delve into, there seems to be a gendered representation of how the anxiety manifests for each of the
Yeah.
characters.
Yeah. So there are, of course, different parts of the story where Tobit's action is highlighted. So already when the journey begins, when Tobit delivers a speech and hires a guide and blesses Tobit, and at this point, Tobit is presented just as a plain-spoken man, whereas Anna is more skeptical and weeps and not sure if the trip is a good idea. And already here we have some discussion on interaction between the spouses, and Tobit is presented as soothing his wife. But then this issue of parental anxiety, as you say, is readdressed later in the narrative, just before Tobias then returns home from Pragues. And at this point, it does seem to me that both of the parents are open about their concerns. So Tobit also counts how many days Tobias has been away, and he also begins to grieve. So he's also showing similar embodied reaction to or caused by his anxiety. And Anna is also so quite traumatic and begins to weep and lament, understandably. Then Tobit calms Anna down. Be quiet and say no word. My sister, he is sound. Do not grieve for him, my sister. He will soon be here. I don't know. I think to me it does seem that the way their relation is portrayed, I think he's truly concerned about the well-being of Anna, and he tries to calm her down and say to her that no worries. But of course, he himself also is worried, and that's also something the text makes explicit. But there is something about how he's nevertheless presented as focusing on soothing Anna, and he tries to find logical explanations for why Tobias has not returned, but Anna is not convinced and she's frustrated and asks Toby to be quiet, goes outside and stares at the road and hopes to see coming back. So perhaps there is this a bit stereotypical portrayal of a woman who is a bit unstable and attacks her husband because of her own sorrow. But I don't think the text says that it's just Anna who is anxious and emotional. I think it also makes it clear that Toby has different types of emotional reactions to things that happens in his life, and also like the way in which Toby focuses on practicalities could serve to hide his anxiety, which is quite a common theme in these narratives, that it's often the father who focuses on, for instance, on the ritual of blessing at the time of departure, a difficult and poignant moment. So there are different ways in which fathers and mothers display and manage their anxiety in situations involving travel and departure. But I don't think either gender is free from travel-related anxiety.
It seems like even the blessing might be a kind of a proactive, maybe cathartic activity, like Anna going out and watching the road is her way of being proactive about trying to be able to spot her son. And the
Yeah.
blessing is Tobit's way of being proactive in the face of the unknown, which is
Yes.
certainly a way to motivate anxiety. How do you think, though, and maybe he wouldn't have an opinion, and if that's the answer, that's the answer. But how do you think Philo would understand this story as far or the travel undertaken in this story? Is this appropriate? Is this necessary? Does this satisfy his definition of what is good travel as opposed to bad travel? How do you see that?
I think, we come to the question of the genre. So I think it's very difficult to compare a philosophical treatise to a novel. So of course there were all kinds of narratives and novels in the ancient world, and Philo also would have read different types of literature as part of his education, and I don't think he he would judge those with criteria derived from philosophical literature if the text itself would present itself as being concerned with the question of soul or the good life or something. I also think he lived in a world filled with travel and movement. And when we come to late Second Temple period Philo's context, the majority of Jews lived in the diaspora. For instance, travel because of marriage arrangements, which is integral to the Book of Tobit. I'm sure that was a phenomenon that was very common in Philo's social circles, and he certainly would have. And this social phenomenon and its importance also in a world characterized by sort of diaspora communities spread across the Mediterranean region. If we now think of how here travel-related anxiety involves embodied responses like crying or prompt motivated action like blessings and farewell speeches, even if those are not phenomena that Philo does discuss, they're part of human life or part of the social life. And I think it would be sort of irrelevant for him. What would he think about this kind of travel? When he talks about soul cultivation, he's talking about very small portion of the society. So in Philo's educational program, there are those with Encyclias Paideia or Encyclica studies, the basic training. Of course, the majority of people can't even read, but those who have some kind of education, first you would start with the Encyclica studies. Then after that, some people move on to pursue philosophy, love of wisdom, virtue, with the intention of becoming a sage or wise figure, and it's extremely difficult to become a wise figure. So when he talks about soul cultivation and withdrawal for the sake of philosophical life or love of wisdom, so I don't think he would ever imagine that these types of movements would be possible to anyone. While I'm sure that in his community, something like marriage-related movement or shuttling between diaspora communities was part of everyday life, but in his philosophical treatises, he's just not interested in discussing those aspects of life in his Jewish community. And it's pity because I would love to know more about the Jewish community in which he lived and what kind of travel practices to them. But yeah, sadly, Philo's treatises enable us to answer only a limited set of questions related to Judaism in the ancient Mediterranean.
But just Jewish identity itself, though, is born out of, like you're saying, the status of being diaspora. So on the one hand, these people who are spread out around mainly the Mediterranean world, but spread out all over the place, all over the world as they know it, there's a certain amount of, they have communities local to where they're from, and so they're cemented there in that regard. And then there's also an aspect of their identity where you mentioned Philo did travel to Jerusalem, so there's a certain number of them making pilgrimages and things like there is travel, but they're not, so they're cemented in a diaspora community that part of its identity is also that it's transitory in that they moved us once, whoever they are, and they can move us again. Is that fair to say? Does that make sense?
Yeah, I'm not quite sure if I get your question, or I'm not sure what you mean.
We have that in common. I'm not sure. I'm still trying to flesh the idea out in my head. It seems like there's some that there is almost this anticipation throughout the history of Jewish identity. It seems like there is this understanding of we may have to pack up and go at any minute. Even the idea of wanting to return to Jerusalem, to the land that, so even though they may be cemented where they live, where they were born, which was not Israel, Judah, the travel is in their ideological genes. Does that make sense?
Of course, in the sense that if you are a member of a diaspora community, or if you hail from a migrant family, so yeah, it would somehow shape your identity. But it's difficult to say to what extent they would be understanding themselves in relation to, say, Jerusalem. Someone like Philo, we don't even know if he knew Hebrew. He went to Jerusalem apparently just once. It doesn't look like Judah or Jerusalem somehow, integral to his identity. But also earlier, if we think, for instance, the book of Esther in the Hebrew Bible, centered on Elisa and the Jewish community that is presented as originating from a man who moved eastwards during the forced migrations of the exile. But they're also like, we have zero interest in Jerusalem or orientation towards the homeland. So I think we should not size their like foreignness or lack of rootedness in the new context. But again, we also should not generalize. I think there were lots of different experiences, and we have to really look case by case. But of course, it might still be, for instance, in the case of Esther, even if there is no orientation towards Jerusalem, there is still this recognition that we or our ancestor was forced to migrate here. So yeah, it does somehow shape one's self-understanding, but it's not necessarily some kind of nostalgic longing to an imagined homeland. And I also so I have now a wider project funded by the European Research Council that focuses on travel in the ancient Jewish tradition. And I'm the PI of the project, but I also have a PhD student and 2 postdocs, and they're doing really interesting things. One of my postdocs is working on Philo and Josephus and Paul as migrant authors, and he's also trying to think critically of diaspora and whether it's a meaningful concept in the case of early Jewish author writing outside of Judah. I also know at the University of Copenhagen there is a project by Frederick Bossen where they are thinking about the diaspora and how to define it and the diversity of responses to living outside of Jerusalem or outside of Judah.
Yeah, I know there's a lot of interesting work. Just the idea that understanding Judaism is a pretty complex topic in scholarship. And I know there are a lot of people putting a lot of digital ink on digital pages and actual ink on actual pages. So that's a thing that I'm trying to wade through. We've been going for over an hour. If I followed every thought that I have, I would eat up your entire day. And it is much later for you in the day than it is for me. It's still morning for me. Trying to land this plane. I'll ask, is there anything in the article that I didn't bring up that you were hoping I would bring up that we didn't cover so far?
I think we have discussed the general point and then also some examples. Of course, we could deepen the discussion regarding each of the case. For instance, the book of Tobit and the reactions of Anna and Tobit and Tobias. And Sarah could invite further reflection. But perhaps we could end with a brief remark on the Aramaic Levi document. We don't need to discuss the text in detail, but just the question of intergroup anxiety is a phenomenon that we have not addressed yet. And in this wisdom poem, we do have an interesting passage that focuses on celebrating the value and good reputation of Jewish wisdom. The text specifies how a Jewish student on the move will acquire new friends, and his wisdom will be recognized and even added by outgroup members. So the poem has an interesting, very assured tone and it expresses confidence that the student will be received well and make new friends on the move. And as such, it's an interesting text that seems to implicitly draw attention to intergroup anxiety and the question of how to encounter possibly competing claims of wisdom on the move. And then what this poem does and what this author does is to boost the confidence of Jewish students in the value of their own wisdom. So I think this is really interesting text in many ways. One might think that the encounter of different cultures or different religious traditions or practices would cause anxiety, but actually the Jewish authors and their accounts, they don't pay much attention to this type of anxiety. But here we do have one example of a text where some kind of intergroup anxiety might be present, but then at the same time the text is not in any way hesitant about travel. It takes travel as a natural part of the life of this Jewish wisdom student and focuses on preparing the Jewish student of wisdom to encountering new people and cultures and perhaps competing claims of wisdom on the move. So it is an example that draws attention to an aspect of travel-related anxiety that one might expect to find in early Jewish literature. But actually, this type of anxiety does not seem to be a dominant concern in the material that we have.
So there are a lot of examples about travel when you compare a contemporary world to the world of antiquity, where we can do so much more, so much faster, at so much less cost to ourselves. And so there's a certain extent to which travel is facilitated for us, but this is an instance where travel was required for them, where it's not for us. So to go and study in any meaningful way, you had to be in the right places, unless you were lucky, fortunate enough to already be in one of the right places. But even if you were in one of the right places, you might need to go to another of them. I can go tour museums all over the world. I am right now discussing an article with someone, 6 time zones away. So we're capable of doing so many more things without traveling that they had to travel for. So I think that was, and thank you. This is why I started adding this question at the end, because I know there's always going to be something I leave out, because I really like to follow what the guest has to say. And this kind of overlaps with what you were saying about Philo, that there was a requirement, a necessity for someone to become a high level expert thinker. You had to travel the world, and we are fortunate enough to live at a time in an age when that is not the case. And I want to hear if you have any thoughts on my response to that, but I also want to hear if are there things that you would recommend, and please throw your books in there, that people check out in any of these transdisciplinary areas for biblical studies. If it applies to this article or not, it doesn't matter. I just want to hear what in biblical studies would you push people to read or listen to or watch?
Wow, that's a big question. There are so many things that are worth reading in general in Hebrew Bible studies. But a few people have written about forced migration, especially in the context of the Babylonian exile, and there is a lot of research on that topic. But then the question of travel in early Jewish tradition is only gaining momentum. But I think there are really interesting things there as well. And I guess I would especially recommend the pioneering work of Catherine Hesser in her book Travel in Jewish Antiquity, or is it Jewish Travel in Antiquity, from 2011. And then more recently we have Mara Niehoff's volume Journeys in the Roman East, Imagined and Real. And then my colleague Gary Hart in the Netherlands has also written on travel, especially in terms of Philo and other authors in the first century CE. So those would be some names, but there are so many great scholars who have made important contributions that I certainly don't want to give the impression that those are the only books to be acquired and read.
Thank you for that. Now, another question I like to ask people: what do you read for fun?
I read for fun. I'm a little bit news junkie, so weekends in the morning when I have lots of time, I go through lots of different news sites in my native Finland, in Denmark. I've also lived in the UK and the US, so also those countries. And then my husband is Australian, so we also follow Australian news. Going through different news sites takes a lot of time during my free time. But then I also really appreciate fiction, novels, short stories, and poetry. And of course, I mostly love to read in Finnish. My native language is what I love, and it's especially when it comes to poetry, for instance, I think it's really makes a difference for me to read something in Finnish. But it can be a lot of different things. Right now, during the Christmas break, I read an interesting novel by a Russian author, Lyudmila Ulikod. I think it's Medea and Her Children in English. Fascinating story of an old widow woman who hosts relatives who travel to her house during the summer holiday season, and it was just great characterizations. Yeah, I guess characterization is my favorite thing when it comes to fiction, and then I like poetry as well. So those would be my things in terms of non-academic literature or news, to which I'm also a bit addicted.
How do you look for characterization to be fleshed out? What element of the novel or short story really makes for good characterization, in your opinion?
I don't know. I think it's just like in general that I don't know if there's something missing from my brain, but I've never been really interested in plot. So I'm interested in the portrayal of the inner life of the protagonists, and I guess some kind of like good description of the moods of the people and what happens inside their head. So that's, I guess, what I appreciate most.
I don't feel like I write descriptive prose as well as I should. And so I'll read an author like George Orwell, and his descriptive prose, he's one of my favorites. His descriptive prose is really good, but I always really like dialogue. I feel like if someone can, and inner monologue that's helpful too, but if dialogue is what I get lost in, because I'm not a very fast reader, but dialogue tends to go, it's a little bit more punchy and I can get through it. If I start to get sleepy and I see, oh, there's a stopping point at the end of this dialogue, I don't worry that I'm going to doze off. But if it's a long descriptive passage, I'll just go back to the last stopping point because I know it's going to be really difficult for me to keep going. Anyway, sorry. So all the books, everything that you recommended will be in the show notes for the listeners. So unless you have anything else for me, I feel we can call this one good.
Thank you for having me. It was a very nice conversation.
Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciated it. Thank you so much for listening. Please subscribe and rate the podcast on your favorite platform. If you are interested in following, supporting, or engaging with the podcast anywhere else, check out the link tree that I've hyperlinked in the show notes. I try to put episodes out as soon as possible for $5 a month on Patreon. So if there's something that I've announced or you've seen on social media, just know $5 a month. You can listen to every episode that I have edited. Take care.